Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian James Kirby Martin. A nationally recognized scholar of early American history, Jim received his BA from Hiram College and his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin. His numerous books include Benedict Arnold, Revolutionary Hero, A Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, and Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution. Jim's activities include designing and writing screenplays about pivotal events in U.S. history, and is executive producer of the 2-hour special television documentary Benedict Arnold, Hero Betrayed, based upon his Arnold biography. Jim has also served on the board of trustees of the Fort Ticonderoga Association and is currently serving on the board of trustees of the Fort Plain Museum. Jim is also a historian consultant to the Oneida Indian Nation of New York, and we're also very fortunate and proud to have him serve as a senior advisor to the Real American Revolution. Today, I'll be talking to Jim about Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution. Jim, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thanks. It's so good to be here. And I'm looking forward to our conversation, Randy. I think that we're into a subject area that people really want to know a lot more about, specifically when we start talking about the history of what we're now calling indigenous peoples. We also know they're known as Indians, and they're also known as Native Americans. And it's really wonderful that we're getting more and more attention on this subject. And one item in that, of course, is the Forgotten Allies book, which I co-authored with one of my colleagues, Joseph Glathar. And let me just tell you a little bit about that, how this all came about. Joe actually was working on a legal project, and this involved Indian relations with the United States, and an attorney invited him to do some research on the subject that involved the Oneida people in relation to the Six Nations of Indians, and he began to do research, found it a fascinating story. But there was one little problem for Joe, and that is that he is one of our most renowned Civil War historians. So he's really an authority on another war and another era. And one day he walked in my office and he said, Jim, I have a project for you. I would just want you to take this over. And that's actually what happened. So as we like to say, Joe began it and I finished it. And we ended up with this book that has received a great deal of praise. And I don't want to pat myself or Joe on the back too much, but the Forgotten Allies is the title, about the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution, a story with all sorts of implications relating to our revolutionary period in American history.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about Forgotten Allies. When and why did the Iroquois Confederation of New York come into being? How was it first formed? And who were the members, for example, and what bonded them together? Can you describe the Confederacy and how it all began?
Yes, I can. First of all, the location we're talking about, what today we would say upstate New York, territory that runs between Albany in the east and Buffalo in the west. So it's all of central New York. And this was a territory, if we go all the way back to the 14th and 15th centuries, where there were 5 Indian nations, Iroquois speaking. They were a language group, but they really weren't getting along very well. And I'll try to identify them here for you very quickly. You had in the west, you had the Senecas in east of Buffalo. And then as you go east, you had the Cayugas. And then in the Syracuse area, you had the Onondagas. And then we get to the group that really we featured in the book, the Oneida Indians, and then headed all the way from the Utica area over to Albany, you then have the Mohawks. And so you have these five nations, and they weren't getting along. It's a polite way to put it. This is the way the story goes. They were very good at fighting among themselves, killing one another. They had all sorts of problems that we really don't want to go into in necessary detail, just the typical nation against nation kind of relationship. And what happened was, and this is the lore, this is the legend that I'm going to present here, as it would have been told through the generations. So you go back to about, well, let's say, the time of before Columbus, around 1450 AD, and what you're into is a period in which there's so much strife and fighting. One of the native peoples rises up, a man by the name of Oneida. It took me a long time to learn how to say that, so I hope I said it properly. But Oneida wanted to bring peace, and that was his mission. And he would travel, basically in Onondaga, and he would travel back and forth. And as it turned out, he wasn't a handsome man, apparently very ugly, short, stooped over, not very impressive. So he then found a good friend, and that friend, Hiawatha by name, would go with him. And over a period of years, they brought these nations together in what was called a League of Peace and Power. So there are two things here, two key words. One is peace. We're going to stop fighting among ourselves. We're going to unify and become a very strong, and become the word that will eventually come out of this is the Iroquois Confederacy, if we would describe it that way. Power is another issue, because that didn't mean that stopping to fight among themselves, that they were necessarily going to stop fighting among their neighbors. And they have a number of neighbors in Canada, like the Hurons, not getting along well with them. And so power is part of defending ourselves, if need be, going on the offensive and going and taking on our enemies to further build our power. And then this all comes together as what we call then the Iroquois Confederacy. And it has its own name. It's like its own empire, if I could describe it that way. And the name of the empire is Iroquois, and that is upstate New York. And so this is their territory in which they try to operate and live well and live peaceably among themselves. In fact, one of the key rules is we never, ever will fight among ourselves, because if we do, we will lose our strength. And if we lose our strength, we will lose everything, because our enemies will ultimately, as external enemies, will eventually overwhelm us and destroy what we have built.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, particularly with regard to the peace and power component. How does that function specifically politically, with so many leaders, outstanding leaders in each of these tribal nations?
Well, one of the things that we need to understand is that for so long we've had an image that Indians, as one of my good native friends would say to me, we're sort of savages. All we are into is sort of skulking in the woods and scalping and maiming and all that sort of thing. And that's really a very, very damaging misimpression, to say the least. And no one really believes that anymore. I'm not trying to suggest that, but there is this rich tradition of that kind of thinking out there, at least in earlier years. And really, when you begin to investigate, like the Iroquois Confederacy, it's a very, very sophisticated political organization. And if you, in its very levels, there are local governments over villages. There are, let's say, take the Oneidas, there's a broader Oneida government. And then they all come together in a council of chiefs called sachems. In this case, they're more or less identified as peace chiefs. 49 of them will gather occasionally and assemble in the Syracuse area at the center of the nation, of these nations. And they, in turn, will try to provide overall policy about how we are going to operate, how are we going to get along, how are we going to deal with those external forces that could at some point overwhelm us. So it is, in that sense, the Confederacy part of it comes together in that Grand Council, which is meeting periodically to deal with whatever the issues of the time might be. Then they make a recommendation, a consensus. We have reached this consensus. I'm going to give you an example in a few minutes of that. We reach a consensus on whatever the issue is, and you can accept it or you can ignore it. But if you ignore it, we more or less suggest maybe you find another place to live. And there's some of that diaspora going on because of this, because there isn't always unanimity. Some Indians will move farther west, others will, of the 5 nations at this point, will move into Canada and so on and so forth. In fact, let me add, because I just slipped and said it, there are in the 18th century 6 nations. One of the Iroquois-speaking Indian groups will come north and will join the Tuscarora people, and they will become the 6th nation in the 18th century. They basically locate in Oneida land, and they don't have direct representation on the Grand Council, but only through the Oneidas that are providing them with the new home, with the new territory to live in. But again, think as a sophisticated system. And I should have added, by the way, that women are very important. This is not like colonial society or European society. Women are very heavily involved in the politics, and that the various clans have what are called, and wolf clan, a deer clan, a turtle clan, whatever kind of a clan you want to talk about, is another form of organization, bringing them together in a variety of ways. And there are clan mothers, and they're actually in charge managing the clans. It is a matrilineal system. It operates, familial relationships operate through the women rather than through the men. And in turn, the clan mothers will select the sachems or the major chiefs that will ultimately meet in the Grand Council. Now, they didn't have that direct of a voice once the Grand Council is meeting. And yet, at the same time, they're heavily involved in a way that, well, actually, if we compare, women don't really become heavily involved in our voting system, until the early 20th century. There are a few exceptions, I realize, before that time. So that's one way to put it. And then the final group that we should identify are the chiefs, that is, chief warriors. And they're not necessarily at the Grand Council, but they advise the Grand Council. And some of them are the major players that will help dictate the direction our 6 nations will go as they confront the issue that will overwhelm them in so many ways during the Revolutionary era, and that is, which side should we be on, if any?
Well, so many of these tribal leaders took a tremendous amount of effort to try to bring harmony among all the tribal nations. But what events began to break down the unity of the Iroquois League before the outbreak of the American Rebellion?
Well, there are a variety, and I will just give you a sampling here, because there aren't any number that could come into play. First of all, the Mohawks, the keepers of the eastern door, have been really being overrun by the westward movement of population coming in first to New York, then to Albany, and then locating westward, moving westward into Mohawk territory. And so that's also part of the problem. They feel like they're being squeezed out, and few will go west toward the Oneidas, but many will also migrate and join various groups and nations in Canada. So that's one kind of a problem right there. Then, to add to that, you have a very powerful individual by the name of Sir William Johnson, who becomes a representative of the Crown, develops very good relations with the Mohawks in a whole variety of ways. They will give him literally thousands of acres of land. And he is sort of the chief negotiator between the English and the Mohawks, and then the rest of the Six Nations at the same time. But he favors the Mohawks in his dealings. And so Sir William becomes a problem because the Oneidas don't like him. And there are 2 or 3 reasons why they don't like him. And I'll just give you a couple. Number one, he is a good Anglican. And the Oneidas are, I'm trying to think of the right term, but they do have a spiritual leader, a Protestant spiritual leader, and this individual will become, and his name is Samuel Kirkland. I'm sort of stumbling to remember it right now. Sorry about that, but Kirkland is a good Presbyterian. And he has been very active in this period in the 1760s and 1770s, and is sort of already talking the pro-American side of issues. And you can't trust Sir William. He's an Anglican. He doesn't do anything from you. He's going to steal your land when he gets done stealing more land from the Mohawks. All that sort of thing comes into play. Then you had a second issue, and that is, I think most of our listeners have heard of the Proclamation of 1763, which is a line that is drawn all the way down from southern Georgia, all the way up through the Appalachians, and will exit Canada. And the idea of that line is to keep the native population on one side and keep the white settlers on the other side, because the British don't want to continue the kind of warfare that has been happening, sort of culminating in what we call the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. So what happens then, you have this general line through the proclamation, but then the line is refined through a treaty at Fort Stanwix. And the line actually, thanks to Sir William Johnson, cuts out part of Oneida territory to be included on the British side. Mm-hmm. And this made several leaders within the United Nation totally furious. Hey, they claimed 6 million acres. They're not hurting for land, given the population, 1,000, 1,500. But they felt that Sir William had sold them down the drain, and that he was always favoring the Mohawks, and he's an Anglican, and we have our kind of faith, which is different from the Church of England, and so on and so forth. And these little issues start to divide. And many of the Mohawk leaders will line up with our friend Sir William. And then you have others, I'm going to give you 2 names here in just a minute, or 3 names. Others on the Oneida side that say, this guy will sell us down the drain. Maybe they call him the chief Indian agent, but he favors one. He doesn't favor us. We don't like him. And let me give you the names that are involved here. On the Mohawk side, you have an Indian, I have a hard time saying his name, Thandingia. He's also known as Joseph Brant. And he is very close in his relations with Sir William. And he's very supportive of the Mohawks. And that he will be a major leader for the Mohawks all the way through the Revolutionary period and the war period. Then on our other side, that is the Oneida side, you have a man named Honyeri Dockstader, a little bit older than, and let's say, I'm going to give you rough ages here. Honyeri's in his late 40s. Joseph Brant is in his 30s, and they don't like each other. They're sort of a reflection of all of this tension. And they will ultimately have a very strong influence in the division that will come among the Six Nations during the Revolutionary period, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is just to give you an example. Yes, they're getting along generally, but the fissures are sort of little cracks in the wall are there. And of course, then once you toss a revolution that spills over into Western New York, into all of this, that's when you're going to have real problems where the Indians have to decide what, if any side, will we belong to.
Mm-hmm. Well, given the fact that they were moving towards disunity, what really was the final cause? What caused the breakdown overall and the neutrality that had existed for so long with the Six Nations as they moved towards rebellion? What were those consequences of the break, if you will?
Okay, and I can do this. It is a fairly complex story, but I'll just give you this one example. Some of the Mohawks followed one of the Johnsons, not Sir William, he passes away in 1774, but a nephew named Guy Johnson. They followed him to Canada in 1775. And in Canada, in Montreal specifically, there's a great big powwow. And what are we going to do? And the Canadian government really wants these Indians to, and being a part of, and being a part of the British, not the rebellious colonies. They want to get the Indians on their side. So they have this great meeting at the end of June of 75. And the Indians, some of the Mohawks, accept war belts. Now, war belts mean we're going to go back down to the valley and into Canada and maybe elsewhere, and we're going to fight for the British. Now, that's not a statement of neutrality, obviously.
Right.
This will provoke or lead to a meeting of the Grand Council. And the Grand Council will debate this issue. We believe, on the whole, that we should remain neutral, that nothing good can come from our involvement. Goes back to what I talked about before. If we let these external enemies interfere in our ways, in our culture, and in our lives, we're going to lose it. We're going to lose things. And so the Grand Council overwhelmingly, in a consensus way, says the Mohawk warriors who took those war belts must give them back. We are going to maintain neutrality strictly among the six. Well, yes, they did give the war belts back, actually gave them to General Philip Schuyler, who's in charge of the Patriot forces in the area. And I only use the term patriot to separate and identify them as those who are the real rebels. And anyway, they give them back, but that doesn't mean that they turn back. And so the Mohawks are starting now to splinter off and get themselves involved in the war on one side, on the British side. This does upset the Oneidas. They don't like this. And they say, no matter what, we're going to remain neutral. We don't care what you do. We are going to remain neutral. But then the year 1777 came along, and that's really another story. But these are the consequences. That's the one little break we talked about in the 1760s. This is the second little break. And then the bigger third break is going to come in the 1777 year.
Well, speaking of 1777, a very important battle occurred called the Battle of Oriskany. And
Yes.
That's depicted in the painting behind you by Don Friani.
There you go. I can move over and you can see a little bit of it.
Yeah,
and there
featuring...
actually is Hanieri is in that painting, as a matter of fact. And Joseph Brant is not in that painting, but they were both in the same battle, and apparently at one point actually fought against each other. But let me then talk about what is the big issue, or the big activities, a better word, in 1777. And that is General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, as he's known, is given orders, of course, he begged to have them, to lead a large force out of Canada to strike through New York, to go all the way to Albany, through northern New York, Lake Champlain we can refer to, and reach Albany. And then we'll send a force out of that the British now control New York City, up from New York City. We then will have a force that can go east and divide the eastern New England area from the rest of the colonies and a house divided is one that will collapse if we put it in those kinds of terms.
Mhm.
That's the plan. As another part of the plan, and this will begin to happen in June of 1777, is that Burgoyne has arranged for a diversionary force that is going to go west up the Richelieu River. No, wait a minute, not the Richelieu, that's the wrong river. St. Lawrence River, on the Lake Ontario, come down and will actually reach a point, a major river, and that will lead south through Oneida Lake and actually right through Oneida territory. And the diversionary force, which is going to be in the 1,800 to 2,000 range, will partially be led. One of the main leader of the British, except, is a man by the name of Barry St. Ledger. But in terms of the Indians, because more than half of this force consists of Indians, primarily Mohawks under Joseph Brant, and then there is a large contingent that comes all the way east, and their leader there, his name is Old Smoke, which he's a major player in all of this period. And they all combine then, and they decide we're going to sweep south to the western end of the Mohawk River. Now that's Oneida territory. And right there is Fort Stanwix, which was part of the land in adjusting the territory back in the 1760s, went to the British, but the Oneidas have a working relationship at that fort, and that fort is actually manned by a force of about 750 Continentals at this particular point in time. So they decide we're going to just sweep south right through Oneida territory. Whoops, here's a problem. In the rules, going back to the League of Peace and Power, we respected each other's territory. Yes, you could come and visit or move through Oneida territory if you had their permission. You could move through Seneca territory to Onondaga territory if you had everybody's permission. But the St. Ledger expedition with Joseph Brant does not have that permission, and the Oneidas will meet, a group of Oneidas will meet with them right on Lake Ontario, and they say, you do not have our permission. We are neutrals. When you are enter the territory, you force us to become British allies. We will not be British allies, no matter what. We're neutral. And what will happen is Joseph Brant and St. Ledger will ignore all of that, and they proceed south in early August of 1777, this force of 1,800 or so. Well, you have a reaction. The Oneidas now are being forced to say, if you don't have permission, you're disrespecting our territory, then we, our warriors, or at least a substantial portion of our warriors, will align with the Americans at Fort Stanwix, and we will indeed resist your movement into the western end of the valley, and that is ultimately sweeping eastward right into Albany, linking up with Burgoyne, coming straight south, and this is all meant to divert and confuse the colonists. I hope I'm explaining this okay.
Yeah.
Because it's a complex story. But what will happen is, because that British Indian force, excuse me if I don't say indigenous, I find it a bit awkward to use that term in these kinds of situations. But you have that British Indian force, and they come to Fort Stanwix. They put Fort Stanwix under siege. In turn, the Americans, representing militia in what's called Tryon County, which is the westernmost county of New York at that particular time, and they will gather, and they will go, and they will challenge. And they will challenge the British, and this is going to lead to one of the bloodiest days of the whole Revolutionary War, the Battle of Oriskany, August 6th of 1777. Let me note that you can go visit this battle site and you can study it. It's very easy because the ground explains basically what happened. Nicholas Herkimer is a local Palatine leader, and he's in charge of that force. They start down through a swale, and the Indians on both sides, including Brant and others, will strike them and trap them. And this is going to lead to a battle in which the American force, 800 or so, with about another 60 to 90 Oneidas actually in the battle, like Honieri and his wife, Tyona, and they have a son who's also involved, and they fight it, and it is a slaughter. It's a big slaughter on the American. When you have a battle in the 18th century in which you're talking 60% plus casualties, that is a slaughter, because the weaponry is not as sophisticated as it will be, obviously, down to our own time. But anyway, the Americans are forced back. They have to retreat. The Oneidas have some casualties, but this is very important. Some of the Senecas actually get killed in the battle. Now we have what? We have Senecas and some Mohawks, maybe a few others from the other nations, and they are killing Oneidas, and Oneidas are killing them. How does that look if you're a real confederacy? Does that look like you're in a league of peace and power? Well, of course not. It is a major turning point, because once they started to glower at each other and went beyond the notion of, well, you took a little bit of our territory or whatever it might have been, once they start killing each other, they're beginning to really, in many ways, disruptive, not completely disrupt and destroy the basis of this whole brilliant organization that they had put together so that they could live peaceably among themselves and defend themselves properly against the rest of the world. It really is the beginning, in many ways, of a very, very sad story that is going to continue and accelerate all the way to the end of the Revolutionary War and into the 19th century, as the Confederacy is, well, I don't know a better way to put it, is more or less swept aside in a variety of ways, so that, well, let me put it this way, and I know we got a lot more we could talk about between this, but I mentioned that the Oneidas claim to have 6 million acres going south from Lake Ontario down to almost Pennsylvania. Think of Utica, New York as the center point. And Fort Stanwix is actually a bit of a center point too. If I remember my numbers correctly, in the year 1900, the Oneidas could claim 36 acres of that territory as their, right there. And then you go right back to Oriskany, and that's the beginning of the story, which I'm certainly happy to continue in a variety of ways.
Sure. Well, how did the Oneidas, after the Battle of Oriskany, how did they formally align with the American cause? Was there a formal agreement? Did they talk to General Schuyler? What facilitated the official alignment with the American cause, if you will?
There was no moment in time in which an actual treaty per se was signed, but there was an understanding that now that we are engaged, now that neutrality is out the window, or however you would like me to put it, once that's happened, we're now going to stand with our good and faithful rebel allies, if I could put it that way. I hate to say patriots or colonists or anything like that, but that's what I'm referring to. And they will. The Oneidas will get involved in the edge of the defeat of Burgoyne in the battles of Saratoga, just a few months beyond what we have taught. Well, actually, month, 2 months. And so they get involved in that, but only marginally. but they're going to continue. And I'll tell you this story. I think it's an interesting one. The Americans had tried, that is, the Patriots had tried, to take Canada in 1775. Mm-hmm. It was a major expedition, involved even Benedict Arnold, our friend Arnold from our last conversation. And the point is, the Americans are driven out, that is, the Patriots are driven out of Canada in 76. There's an idea in 78, early 1778, to reinvade Canada, to bring Canada in finally as the 14th colony in rebellion. George Washington gives the assignment to, of all people, the Marquis de Lafayette, just happened to speak a lot of French, no surprise there. Sent him north to see if he could organize in early 1778 a force to move into Canada. Well, Lafayette went up. He's all at 21 years old, as I remember at this point in time. Maybe he was still 20, but he's a major general and had done some successful campaigning. And he takes one look and he says, nope, that'll never work. He goes to the Albany area. Then he receives a message from Washington. Maybe he could go and visit our friends, the Oneidas, and see if they might be willing to come, some number of them, and help us do scouting work out of Valley Forge. The Valley Forge winter is going on in 1777-78. To wrap the story up, Lafayette goes west. He gets involved in a series of meetings, and the Oneidas will agree to send a band of warriors to Valley Forge, and they do go to Valley Forge in the spring of 1778. The leader of that group actually will be Han Yeri. He keeps coming up in our story. There's a deal that Lafayette, with certain individuals, help defend Oneida territory, because now they have a fear that Joseph Brandt's going to come out of Western New York and attack them and destroy their villages, all that sort of thing. In fact, Brand had already helped destroy one of the Oneida villages shortly after the Oriskany battle. But the point is, now the Oneidas, about 60, with a few Tuscaroras thrown in, again, becoming a bit of a part of the Oneida Nation, go to Valley Forge, 250 miles away, and they then will join a force under Lafayette, a reconnaissance force, in May of 1778. And their purpose is to do scouting. They're going to scout the British, who are in control of of Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, what are the Brits going to do? We need to know more. And so this expedition of some 2,000, including the Oneidas, goes out, and the British, with good intelligence, knew they were headed in their direction from Valley Forge, and they plan a massive attack to catch Lafayette off guard. And this is around May 20th of 1778. And what happens is the Oneidas will help defend the Americans as they're fighting, or the recrossing the Schuylkill River, which is on the other side, is Valley Forge, that is the other side from Philadelphia. And actually, 6 of the Oneida warriors will be killed in that defense, saving Lafayette's force. Now, that's a very, very little, the Battle of Barren Hill, very, very little known story. In fact, you can visit the gravesite of those 6 Oneidas today at a local church in the Barren Hill area. And so that's the point. They keep themselves involved. They just don't, they just don't say, okay, we're going home, we're going to do everything to protect ourselves. And meantime, they are being run over by the Brandt forces that are coming out of the Fort Niagara area, Buffalo, or actually closer to the falls, and so on and so forth. And so they have been forced east for protection. They're losing their villages, and everything for them becomes a mess. But they remain loyal to the Americans. Now, this has then some very important consequences, because ultimately the war is going to come to an end. And we can go in and talk about that a little bit if you'd like, about what happened to the Six Nations and the Oneidas.
Well, that was actually my next question. Looking back on the revolutions, the consequences, what conclusions can we draw? Overall, how damaging was the involvement in the Revolutionary War to the tribal nations making up the Iroquois Confederacy?
It was very damaging. And that is the beginning of the decline and actually dispersal out of New York in the late 18th and into the 19th century. Let's go to the year 1783, where we have what's called the Peace of Paris. And the British, who had promised everything to the Mohawks and any other Indian group that would stand with them and fight against the patriot cause or to fight against the rebels, whatever we want to call them. The British forgot about them in the treaty, gave them no recognition, promised nothing for them, cast them aside. So now those that fought against the American forces, what can I say, is they're left high and dry. And so there will be treaties that, in the two that we'll concentrate on are treaties at Fort Stanwix again in 1784. One is with the nations involving the state of New York. One is with the Continental Congress and the government under the Articles of Confederation. I'm just going to combine the two in terms of the results are pretty much the same. One of the interesting tidbits is Lafayette's at one of these events, and he gets up and he speaks, and this is before he leaves the country, obviously, but it's in 1784. And he said, you know, I told you, some of you, that if you stood up against this cause and it won, you would be the big losers. And I'm sorry about that. I know my friends, the Oneidas, are not necessarily going to be the big losers, but some of the rest of you, from the Mohawks all the way through the Senecas, you're going to get hit. And they did. By the treaties, they had to give up significant chunks of land that they claimed as their own, running along Lake Ontario, all the way over to the Buffalo area and to the falls area, the Niagara Falls at Fort Niagara. So they had significant land losses. And so they really did, this really hurt them because they don't have any friends that are going to stand, and the Brits have abandoned them. But what about the Oneidas? The Oneidas had friends. And those Oneidas that are involved find that they are treated in 1784 very exceptionally. We just thank you. There are various words that were given earlier in the war that I'll try to capture or paraphrase a little bit. That you have been our great friends. We will never forsake you. And as long as the moon and the sun and all the mothers in the world live, we will stand with you and by you. Great rhetoric, which we identify up front in the book because it's part of the irony of what's going to happen. So the Oneidas in 1784, they have to reconstruct their world, their villages, three of them, Cananwallowhale, over by Oneida Lake, Oriskany, a second village, which was Han Yeri's primary point of operation, and then Aquaga, which was down more on the south of that area, closer to the Pennsylvania border on the Susquehanna River, and they've been destroyed. And so they have to try to go back and build their world. And their numbers have been have taken a beating too. They have suffered many casualties in the war. They're in bad shape. The point about this is the man who was actually ends up being a vice president of the United States, but he was the governor of New York, a man by the name of George Clinton, very active, revolutionary, well-known. George Clinton says, and he's not the only one, they have 6 million acres and their villages are destroyed. What are they going to do with all that land? And so some of these New Yorkers come back a year later, 1785. Wouldn't you want to share some of that land with us? Wouldn't you want to rent it to us? Or maybe for a reasonable price, we can sell it to you. And that is the beginning of the process of the disposition of even those who fought on the Patriot side. Now, what I should point out, there was an additional treaty that was made in the 1790s that we will forever recognize your territory, and the Oneidas do sign that treaty, and that treaty is still being honored today, and it's one of the bases of the Oneidas, and I don't know that much about the other nations, but probably they're involved in this too, where they still are allowed to call themselves separate independent nations within the state of New York and within the United States. So there are a lot of legal implications about that. But mostly what happens is there will be great migrations elsewhere with the Oneidas. Some of them will relocate into Canada. Others, more perhaps than stayed in New York, they will actually migrate to Wisconsin, and they will be interestingly, a powerful force in the Green Bay area. I presume they're all Green Bay Packer fans for all I know. But the main groups that was there in the beginning remains, and they're still very much in central New York today. In fact, let me mention the Oneidas are prospering mightily. They had to go through a very, very dark period, trapped on a reservation with little support. And finally, the generation of leadership led by a man by the name of Ray Halbritter will stand up and say, enough is enough is enough. We are going to make our own way. We're not going to keep whining and complaining. Yes, we only have 36 acres for a reservation, but we are going to go out and we're going to demand that we make our way in this world. And today, the Oneidas are among the wealthiest of nations in the United States, almost enviously so. They're located right off the New York Thruway, near Rome, New York, and Oneida, New York, as points in the map. Their area is called Turning Stone. They have championship golf courses. They have major hotels, 4- and 5-star. They became a major entertainment gambling center. They have an auditorium that's just, as I remember, about 8,000 people constantly entertaining central New York. Right now, I hope I'm not overstating this, they are the largest employer in central New York. They didn't give up, and they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, for which, from my point of view, they really deserve great credit in becoming a people that not only the people of the Standing Stone, as they're known, but as a people that we should greatly respect. That, well, I'm trying to figure out how to avoid the stereotype of savagery. And I also want to point out, as part of just a little concluding statement here, that when we're doing Native, Indian, Indigenous, whatever term you want, history these days, we have a problem. And that is that we look at it in very simplistic terms. I'm going to go back to 1939 and Drums Along the Mohawk, Henry Fonda, the movie. And in that movie, which was characteristic of that era, there are only two sides. There are Indians, bad, whites, good. And the whites are just casually moving out and taking over Indian lands. And amazingly enough, the Indians come along and start to burn out and pillage and rip the landscape apart because these people, were just apparently they were owed that territory without consulting the Indians. So you got good guys and bad guys. Now we've got the great reverse going on in modern indigenous history. There's something out there that apparently Indians don't like to be called Indians. I'm sorry, I've talked to a number of Indians, and some of them like being called Indians. Mm-hmm. Right there. I know that's a controversial statement. I live with it because I had those conversations. The point is that now the good guys are the white people and the bad guys are the Indians. The good guys never participated in a massacre. The Indians never participated in a massacre. The whites were all doing the massacres. Mm-hmm. And then this leads to terminology which has become the story of genocide. All right. Then we have the other kind of story that has been, well, it's not quite genocide because not all the Indians are dead. In fact, their numbers are growing significantly now as we move well into the 21st century. Then we got to go to ethnic cleansing, of course. We just move them and we move them and we move them and move them. And hopefully they'll all die in the process of moving across the country. Now, this is all well and good. But in the story that I've been telling, it doesn't represent any of that. Because if I'm not mistaken, and I know I'm right on this one, Han Yeri works actively with white settlers in the area and fights alongside them. They work Indians on one side and whites on the other. Look at Joseph Brant. He developed a powerful fighting force, and it's not the only one involving the British, the Canadians, whites, Sir John Johnson's Royal Greens, which are loyalists primarily, whites, next to hundreds and hundreds of Indians. And they're fighting on both sides. Mm-hmm. And that's the better representation of history. When you get into the story and you get beyond rather shallow, sweeping statements that don't hold up under close inspection, when you do find those important details that defy those generalizations, you ought to start to think very carefully about how you're writing your history, because it was so misleading 60, 70, 80, or 100, or 200 years ago, what was being written. And my point is, unless you get into the story properly and don't enter with some preconceived ideology, if you get into it properly and you get into the archives and you do the real research, you're going to find the new story is probably, this ethnic cleansing, this kind of genocide logic, broad sweeping. It doesn't hold up, and it's, from my point of view, could even be described as equally misleading. So that's my little sermon. I believe there's a great story to be told, but I also believe we really need to learn how to tell the story correctly and properly and honestly. So let me sort of wrap up with that little sermon, okay?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Finally, just one final question here. Sure. What do you want readers and listeners to take away from Forgotten Allies? I mean, what's the one thing you want people to remember after listening and particularly reading this book?
Well, I think maybe I summarized a little bit of it, and that is, this is an incredibly important story to understanding and realizing the realities of the American experience, involving not just whites, not just Indians, but so many other kinds of groups in our society. And we need to be aware of that. We don't want to oversimplify the story. We want to tell the story as honestly as we can and not try to score, if I could put it this way, current political points by using the information from the past. That's what Joe and I did. We began it, as you know, with Lafayette visiting the Oneidas in 1825 as part of his grand tour. And the period of the 50 years celebration of the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And there's now a tendency, sorry to say this, there's a lot of political stuff going on. We're going to manipulate that history to prove this or that, a particular point. Be aware that is going on, and just don't accept everything somebody with a hidden agenda, or maybe not too hidden agenda, is trying to tell you. Read the real story. And that's my plug for the book. It is the real story. And in fact, I've told you, I'm working with a group of people to turn this into a miniseries on one of the major streaming services, television networks. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I certainly wish you the best of luck there.
Thank you.
It's certainly needed, to say the least. So, Jim, thanks so much for joining me today. It was delightful talking to you about this wonderful book. And I
Well, I
hope we can do it
appreciate the
again sometime.
opportunity, and it certainly has been my pleasure to be with everyone today.
Super. Well, to our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian James Kirby Martin, author of Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution, an outstanding book which is available on Amazon and A-Books. Join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian on the real American Revolution. So long for now.